Speak the charm of make, charm of make, charm of make, charm of make, charm of make.
There will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten. When wizards will rule the world.
This is the Arnemancy podcast, exploring esotericism, tarot, magic, and the occult. I am Reverend Eric. Most esteemed listeners, I have heard in the ancient podcasts of the Arabians that Dan, the modern hermeticist, on being asked what on this stage, so to say, of the internet, seemed to him most evocative of wonder, replied that there was nothing to be seen more marvelous than Ted Hand, and that celebrated exclamation of Hermes Trismegistus. What a great miracle is Ted Hand, Asclepius, confirms this opinion. I am here today with Ted Hand, a teacher and independent scholar. Hi, Ted.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you doing?
Oh, doing great.
How's the weather down there?
You know, I'm enjoying a nice hotel stay in the lovely city of Monterey, California, so it's a nice fresh coastal breeze right now.
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure Monterey was the setting of many surfer movies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. You have a couple of really cool things going on that I think we should talk about. First, you studied angelology.
Yeah, I was working on Pico della Mirandola, who's a Renaissance guy. He was the Count of Concordia, and he got himself in a bit of trouble with the old Inquisition for suggesting that magic and Kabbalah are the best way to prove the divinity of Christ, and various other heretical propositions which he wanted to defend in a giant disputation of 900 conclusions. Mm-hmm. He wrote what's considered one of the classics of the Renaissance, the Oration on the Dignity of Man, as well as some other little texts that, like I said, got him in a bit of hot water, out of which he was rescued by Cosimo de' Medici, the Republican at the time, and mm-hmm. He was also involved in some disputes with Marsilio Ficino over the meaning of magic and Neoplatonism and metaphysics and stuff. So there's a lot for the interested hermeticist.
How did that tie into angelology, though? Isn't angelology like the study of angels?
So in his Oration on the Dignity of Man, Pico said that man can become like an angel. He's doing what Dan Atrell started calling some kind of angelomorphic mysticism, where he's following this guy Pseudo-Dionysius, who he just called Dionysius the Areopagite. He didn't realize he was a pseudo, who was this Neoplatonist Christian writing in the 5th century or so, and elaborated this whole mystical theology and the concept of angelology as we know it, which was basically a way of expounding this Neoplatonic cosmos rooted in the thinking of Proclus and Plotinus and Iamblichus. And so Pseudo-Dionysius actually uses the term theurgy all over the place, and it's kind of like this magical cosmos in the way that our Renaissance guys saw the cosmos. But for Dionysius, he's using theurgy to understand sacramental theology. He's trying to understand what the Christian rituals like the Eucharist are doing. And he sees that as similar to the way that the Neoplatonists saw what they were doing with their religious rituals. And so he uses the theory of theurgy. And I got interested in the way that Pico was getting co-opted by later Christian Kabbalists like John Dee, who was having conversations with angels using these grimoire techniques. Mm-hmm. But he was also, in addition to using these, conjuring books, he was deeply involved in the Neoplatonism of Ficino and Pico. And so John Dee, there's this annotation to his copy of Pseudo-Dionysius where John Dee is like writing the names of the angels that he discovers in his grimoire books, and trying to like process his whole experience of summoning angels with reference to the classics of his own Christian tradition of angelology.
All right. I guess I honestly did not even know what to expect about angelology. I didn't realize that it was tied to Pico and stuff, and that's really fascinating. What was Dan saying? The
angelomorphic. So Pico says man has these like seeds in him of like all things, and depending on which seeds he's going to kind of put his will toward, he can mature into an animal or he can mature into an angel.
Is that through metempsychosis or through just like in the body or in your...
Yeah, sort of like in the body. Yeah, it's not about sort of like being reincarnated as an angel, but it's about becoming an angel kind of here and now. So yeah, Pico sort of advances this mysticism where one is kind of imitating the angels and aspiring to be like them and sort of becoming angelic.
All right, I can see how that would be totally influenced by Kabbalah too. Although, okay, so we should, like for the listener, we should probably fill in a little bit of the details here. So Pico della Mirandola was he lived at the end of the 15th century.
Right.
He was born in like the 1460s and died in the 1490s by poison.
Right. Sadly, yeah.
Yeah, and so during this period of time, this was basically Pico and Ficino sort of launched the Italian Renaissance. So without them, we never would have had John Dee. We never would have had Robert Flood. We never would have had Agrippa. We never would have had any of the cool people that occultists like to latch onto. We probably also never would have had capitalism, which would be cool.
One wonders.
But, the good, the bad, they always go hand in hand. So Pico and his circle down in Florence, they were basically the first ones in a long time in Europe to get access to all of those classic dudes that you were talking about. Proclus and Plotinus and Diabolicus, like all of that stuff was being published in like Florence and Venice, translated and published for the first time into Latin and European languages ever, unless you can't count, except unless you want to count Greek. So they were really kind of like on the bleeding edge of all this stuff. Like to them, this was sort of, I guess today it would be sort of the equivalent of if Jobs and Wozniak hadn't invented an Apple computer, but had like dug it up and been like, oh my God, the ancients had this computer. Let's create a spreadsheet and change the world or whatever. So it's sort of, it's difficult for us to understand probably the level of excitement that they must have had coming across this ancient knowledge that was just sort of like, because, so they probably already had, Pseudo Dionysius, right? So he was already extant, but then they were getting older stuff that was confirming it, or sort of like the stuff that Pseudo Dionysius had talked about. And that's kind of fascinating too. Like you were talking about Pseudo Dionysius using the word theurgy all over the place. But when you look at then like Plotinus and Diabolicus, they had arguments about theurgy. Right. So there was kind of like, as they were translating this stuff, they were uncovering this sort of like depth of mystical philosophy, which must have been fascinating. So Ficino, do people say Ficino or did they say Ficino?
Ficino.
Ficino. All right, cool. So Ficino was the one doing most of the translating, right?
Yeah, he also translated the works of Plato and the Corpus Hermeticum, right? The legendary writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which he believed actually were written by the ancient Egyptian sage of legend.
Yeah, which would be awesome if it was true.
Right.
So, but you were just saying a little bit ago that Pico and Ficino had a disagreement. That they
and I'm glad that you mentioned the differences between Iamblichus and Plotinus, right? It's actually Plotinus' student Porphyry who Iamblichus is arguing with in the De Mysteriis, also translated by Ficino. And we see some differences between, Plotinus is sort of more the pure mystic whereas Iamblichus wants to interact with the spirits in a certain way, right? Iamblichus sees theurgy as interacting with the gods through these intermediary beings, like angels and whatever, and heroes and daimones, and all of these creatures of the intelligible world that we can interact with as intermediaries that sort of convey our theurgic works to the gods,
which would be sort of what Dee was trying to do.
Which may be, a way of interpreting what Dee was trying to do. Now, Pico and Ficino have their own differences, and these guys were looking at, the critiques of Iamblichus and the arguments that he was having with Porphyry, which, actually may have turned out to just be a sort of exercise in debate rather than Porphyry actually expressing a bunch of anti-religious ideas, right? That he was actually just sort of being a devil's advocate and giving Iamblichus some ammunition, right, to respond to. And Pico and Ficino kind of had their own differences over the theory of love, which you can find in the Symposium, and another great example is the so-called Metaphysics of the Parmenides. Plato wrote this very long and difficult dialogue, the Parmenides, which is a bunch of questions about the theory of forms and about the one, and just sort of in the Neoplatonists, it gets articulated into these huge commentaries that are giant bricks of tomes where you're getting into every little line of this work of Plato, thinking that it conveys allegorical mysteries, right? That there's all this hidden metaphysics in this book. And Pico, on the other hand, says, no, it's just an exercise, right? It's just sort of playing around with these ideas as a kind of intellectual gymnastics. And Pico's idea kind of anticipates what modern scholars think about that dialogue, right? They don't agree with the Neoplatonists who Pico is criticizing, and they don't think that the Parmenides is meant to be this deep metaphysical secret, right? It's not like this big riddle. It's just a series of exercises for thinking about the theories that they're elaborating there. And so in some ways Pico is kind of hard-headed and kind of anticipates modern critical scholarship on a lot of this material. He's trying to do a new philological project investigating the Kabbalah and trying to establish Jewish sources, which had previously been kind of out of bounds of humanistic scholarship because they considered the Talmud to be really irrational and crazy, and they kind of demonized and abused it. The medieval Christians did. And so, they saw the Latin and Greek literature as being the two pillars of scholarship, and Pico tried to make it three. And he said, well, we've got all this great Hebrew literature too, right? And after Pico, he really initiated this Christian Kabbalist tradition. So all of those guys that you were mentioning, people like Reuchlin and Agrippa and Dee and all the other great Christian Kabbalists. Kunrath, Nor von Rosenroth and Guillaume Pastel and Giles de Viterbo, all these great guys. That was all sort of inaugurated by Pico saying, look, humanism should be paying attention to this stuff. And he was making kind of scholarly arguments that this is serious material, that it correlates with Christian ideas, right? It's good philosophy, it's good mysticism, all of this Jewish mystical material. It's not just nonsense like has been previously advertised.
So I guess in my head, I definitely haven't done as much study of Pico as you have, but I always sort of figured Pico and Ficino were like buddies. I mean, maybe they were. Maybe they were buddies who disagreed. I've got buddies like that.
Part of the problem here is, Frances Yates, when she wrote her story of Pico and Ficino in books like Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, or, the Elizabethan Age book she wrote, or the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, all that, she really presents Pico as like this student of Ficino, when really they were kind of more independent, and they didn't have this master-pupil sort of relationship. I mean, Pico was obviously younger and, looked up to Ficino in certain ways, but he really saw him as, as like a colleague. But they weren't as close as that line of thinking might lead us to believe. It is true that Pico didn't want to hurt Ficino's feelings, and he was reluctant to publish certain things, and he was at other times not so much pulling his punches. It's interesting that there's almost like a love-hate relationship. There's like a competition going on, and Pico is very harsh when he has a criticism he wants to make.
All right, so then Pico. All right, so Ficino, he was pretty big on love also, and this concept of love sort of continued to be developed by a lot of Renaissance thinkers, and particularly in the occult milieu. I mean, I don't know if they necessarily called themselves occultists, but like, Bruno wrote a lot about it. I think Agrippa probably has some stuff on it. And I know Ficino definitely talked about it quite a bit. What did Pico think? What was his take on that?
I'm not really prepared to get into a discussion of the theory of love today, I'm afraid.
Right.
That's something that's worth researching. I recommend a book to read is Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Culiano, which is, this magisterial study of the concept.
Oh, yeah, it's an excellent book. I love that book.
So yeah, you can read about the differences. I also recommend Michael Allen in an anthology of essays on Pico by M.V. Doherty. There's a great Birthday of Venus article by Michael Allen, which gets into some of the metaphysical differences. Pico wrote this commentary on a poem by a friend of his named Benevieni, and it's called the Commento. And there's this, there's a lot of weird allegory in there, and it might not have been written seriously as like an exposition of Pico's own metaphysical views, so we have to treat it with some caution. And apparently he might not have wanted it to get out there like later in his life when he became kind of more conservative and less, shocking and more mystical and less magical. He might not have wanted to put out the kind of like radical Neoplatonic like cosmos that he advances. And so even when it comes to the arguments that Pico has about the interpretation of Plato's Symposium, the theory of love that we find in there with Ficino, there's also a question of what he thought, best suited the kind of Christian propriety that he was trying to advance. While it was pretty daring that he was advancing these ideas about magic and Kabbalah, it's really a very kind of scholarly ivory tower kind of argument that he's making. He's not trying to burn it all down. He's not like this crazy eyes flashing sort of a prophet. Although, to be fair, he did fall in with Savonarola and got involved in some pretty weird politics for his time. But, he was still trying to be a good Christian, right? He wasn't a heretic. He didn't believe that any of the stuff he was saying was heretical. As Amos Edelheit points out, he was arguing with the dogmas of the scholastic, like medieval theologians, as if those were like the doctrines of the church. And he said, you can believe whatever you want about a scholastic opinion so long as you have true faith. And he kind of differentiated between faith and opinion. And, he was doing theology, and he wasn't quite, he wasn't very tactful about it. And that's why the popes hated the fact that he was doing theology, right? He was really smart, and he was working on all this philosophical and religious material from many different cultures and many different languages that the average theologian at the time did not understand. So the people of the Vatican who had to judge him, didn't know how to read all that deeply in Greek, didn't know how to read in Hebrew at all, right? And how are they supposed to make all of this wild material where he just dumps 900 conclusions on on Rome and says, "Here, figure all this out," right?
I love
Let's argue.
The 900 conclusions. It's such a ridiculous amount of material. He's basically on the cutting edge of all of this new knowledge. And he just gets so fired up. He's just spitting out arguments like crazy. Of course the church isn't going to be able to keep up. But at the same time, it's kind of dangerous to do that. The church, I guess by the 15th century, the church wasn't doing so hot. And it's not like it was packed full of scholars and deep thinkers at the high level. Like all of the administration were kind of just I mean, when Pico started, it was what? It was whoever was before Alexander the Seventh or whatever, right? Pius?
I couldn't give you a historical rundown of which popes are when. That's something that I should probably get straight in my head, like make a little timeline about that.
Oh yeah,
but
well, one of the popes was so mad at Pico that Pico had to run away to France.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
and Medici bailed him out. That is my understanding.
It must have been Pius II. That's what I'm going to guess. Pius II.
Pius II. That makes sense.
Yeah,
that's a familiar name to me.
So he gets all pissed off at Pico. Pico has to run away to France for a little while, and then this is after Cosimo has died, right? So Cosimo's son Lorenzo agrees to be like Pico's parole officer or something. So Pico's allowed to come back, and that's around the time that he starts getting in with Savonarola, right?
Right.
And for those of you guys who don't know out there, Savonarola is like the best embodiment of like the mad monk archetype. Like he's just this. So Florence is just filled with pagan imagery now. You know, there's like you've got like Botticelli and Michelangelo and like all these dudes doing like paintings of naked people and you know, gods having orgies and blah 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 here and there. And you've got Ficino with all of his stuff about love and angels, and you've got Pico doing all of his stuff, and everybody's challenging the church, and it's decadent and it's just filled. It's sensual, right? You can look at this. Yep. I mean, you can look at that.
Pagan.
It's absolutely pagan. They were basically the first neo-pagans. But Savonarola is a extreme reaction to that, where he's sort of so strict and so like, you know, I don't even know how his theology is bizarrely strict. So strict, in fact, that he gets kicked out of the church.
Right.
But he gets this huge following really quickly, and it to me, when I look back at this, it just always has this feeling of this such a bizarre mob mentality, where the mob at first is sort of way on the side of the knee of the pagan movement. Savonarola shows up, and the mob just shifts over, and now they're all like devout ascetic Christians, to the point where like Pico joins his cause, Botticelli joins his cause and like takes a bunch of his artwork out in the street and burns it, which we know now is the bonfire of the vanities, where they just destroyed tons of awesome artwork and stuff. And in fact, at some point, Savonarola, his faction takes over Florence.
And then that got put down, and that was the day that Pico was poisoned, right? Was when...
oh, man. The day that Pico was poisoned, and Charles VIII of France rolls into town.
Taking over, yeah.
And then Ficino has a quote about that, about, you know, he's lamenting Pico's death, but still saying, like, oh, thank God Charles VIII is here to save us all.
Yeah.
So Savonarola wasn't universally liked. I think he was a very polarizing figure. I think it's bizarre that Pico fell in with him. And I wonder how much of that is just a reaction to Pico being censured by the church. Like, did he just sort of say, you know, I might be some sort of crazy angel wizard, but this dude over here, who's some sort of like crazy ascetic monk, also got censured by the church, so we should just sort of like hang out together? Like,
yeah, I don't really know anything about the psychology of why Pico made that decision. You know, I don't know if that's even really received a lot of attention in the scholarship. It's a great question.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, just like I think the most baffling Savonarola thing to me is still just that artists were destroying their own artwork.
Right. Yeah. So one thing I'll say about that is if you read this Edelheit book about Ficino, Pico, and the crisis and humanist theology, he makes the argument that Pico and Ficino are really responding to the same crisis in Renaissance theology. You know, the same crisis in humanism. They have different kind of competing takes on it, right? Different competing ways of doing theology in a new way, right? And whereas Ficino is looking, you know, to this like astral magic and talismans and astrology. Pico rejects astrology and is looking into more Kabbalistic numerology. You know, they're looking into different resources for tackling this problem, but you know, they're still responding to this crisis of theology. And so, I mean, I guess the best answer is that Pico, for whatever reason, saw in Savonarola, you know, an alternative to the problematic sort of theology that the church was doing. That, you know, that I guess like somehow Savonarola was still compatible with Pico's highly intellectual, you know, revival of the classics, or maybe not. You know, I'm not sure if we can see that as a turn. I don't really know how to interpret that, but I recommend reading that Edelheit book, which is something that I'm still tackling myself. For anybody who's interested in a lot more about that theological universe.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Well, I know Savonarola was really well read. Like he was not dumb. He was a very intelligent and weirdly charismatic guy. Yeah, that's a fascinating period of time. And just sort of like what came out of the mess of Florence. Like towards the end, it definitely got messy. The Medicis that were left were they certainly didn't live up to the standards that one would have if they knew Cosimo and Lorenzo. Like they kind of got kind of crappy. So you had like that new academy sort of thing that Ficino started in Florence. Tell me a little bit more about Pico's take on Kabbalah. So he's sort of the founder of Christian Kabbalah. What Kabbalistic texts was he reading? Do we know what material he had access to?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of great research on that recently. The classical studies were done by a guy named Chaim Warzubski, who unfortunately passed away in the middle of his project. And so he only had a chance to look at about half of the material that Pico had. So, you know, back in the 15th century, Pico, being well-connected and being rich, he was able to obtain a lot of rare Kabbalistic texts. And he was able to get them translated by this very interesting kind of roguish, kind of scandalous figure of Flavius Mithridates, who was a Christian.
Flavius Mithridates?
Yeah,
what kind of name is that?
And it's a beautiful name. And so he was a Jewish apostate who converted to Christianity, and he's kind of an unreliable narrator as a result. But he was translating for Pico and giving an explanation of the, you know, sort of secret oral tradition that goes along with the text, right? So he was making some claims, you know, that may be dubious or may not be, maybe kind of biased in a certain direction because he's trying to explain it as a Christian convert to a Christian philosopher. But they had books like the Bahir and the Zohar, and they had this great parchment. They had a book called the Gate of Light.
Oh, yeah.
And so they had a lot of what were not corrupt texts. This is according to Giulio Busi, who's the guy working on the Pico project. And so he's got translations of the texts and introductions and, you know, puts it all in context and explains it in a lot more updated way than you can also read in Warzubski's Pico's encounter with Jewish mysticism, which is also a must-read if you're working on this stuff. There's also some work by Moshe Edel in his research on Italian Kabbalah. So Pico had, you know, some great sources. He had a lot of Kabbalistic material. Now his Hebrew was only kind of intermediate, you know, level. When he started the project, he was able to kind of compose a letter in Hebrew, right? He wasn't able to do, you know, as much as one would hope. And I mean, he didn't end up living that long, so he didn't become, you know, the deepest Kabbalist we can imagine, but he was actually pretty good at it. And Busi has pointed out that when he doesn't have access to a certain text with a certain theory, he is able to nevertheless reconstruct it because he's a good enough Kabbalist and able to be creative with that material. And, you know, one of his texts that he had access to when he was in a hurry to finish writing his 900 conclusions happened to be a really good abstract on, you know, explaining a diagram of the Sephirot. So he was able to get, you know, a distilled text of authentic Kabbalah that gave a whole lot of information about the Sephirot. For example, something I was just recently reading in Bucy. So, you got to read Giulio Bucy on this material. We're only now finding things out about it. Some of the Latin translations that we have of Pico's Kabbalah, I mean, they haven't even been worked on. They've just been sitting in the Vatican unread for hundreds of years, I guess Giles of Viterbo did have some of it copied, which then spread out into the Christian Kabbalah that we know about. But a whole lot of Pico's material has just been sitting there unread. Like, we'd love to have more people working on this stuff. If anybody's interested, all you need to know is the Latin, right? And it's beginning to be translated into English. But it could be that there's material in there that is actually going to help us reconstruct lost Hebrew works of Kabbalah.
That would be nice.
And we're talking the early Kabbalah. There's early stuff there, so it's it's really great to have this stuff. It's really cool that Pico did that project. It's sort of it was legitimate scholarship back then. It anticipated a kind of scholarship that wasn't even happening in Europe at the time, and it's still a valuable to today to Kabbalistic scholars. So it's great material. Not only if you're interested in the Christian Kabbalah, but if you're also interested in the reception of the Hebrew Kabbalah, if you're interested in 15th century Italian Kabbalah, what was being translated into Latin, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting time because it's still, 80 years before Cordovero and, Cordovero, wait.
Right, and Luria and all that stuff, yeah.
I will totally look that up. So I'd love to see what they were working on. You hear when you read about the Renaissance that all of the crap that was happening in Spain, with the diaspora of the Jews out of Spain and stuff, that's how... Yeah, but that's only like 2 years before... Pico died. So there's probably, I would guess that he got access to Kabbalistic texts before that.
Yeah, he was doing that in what the mid 1480s was when he began his 1486 was it when he started learning Hebrew and doing this Kabbalistic research. Sorry, I don't have my notes and dates in front of me, so
that's all right. Just make it up.
Not prepared to give that lecture. 1480s. I mean, it was only a project that lasted 6 years before he. It's too bad that he didn't stick around and do more of that research.
Yeah, but at the same time, think of the weird timing around his death. He's poisoned the day that Charles VIII rolls into town. He's basically, possibly Savonarola's loudest supporter. Definitely one of the most famous and notorious people in Florence at the time. And Savonarola, I don't know how big his support was in 1494, but it couldn't have been... Florence must have been a mess.
It's very Game of Thrones. Let's just say that Pico's death is very Game of Thrones. Anybody who's a, literary author... or TV writer or whatever. There's a mini series in this, right? This should be on Netflix, right? This is juicy material. There's also a scene, where Pico kidnapped a woman, right? And, he was doing this at a chivalry, right? I'm sure. He was trying to rescue her from her situation. Like, he got in trouble. I guess a bunch of his men got killed in this incident. And so, wow. That once again would be a great thing to write about. I mean, it's interesting to compare that to the Chaucer case, right? Which, recent information has come up about Chaucer's Raptus case, which might have been a kidnapping or might have been a rape. But, the famous Middle English literary author Chaucer, the inventor of the English language as we know it, right? He was accused and exonerated in his day of raptus, and people argue about, what's the meaning of raptus? Did he rape this woman? Did he kidnap her? Right? What happened there?
Wow.
So that, there, once again, that's an interesting comparison one could make, of these, these famous writers and philosophers who get in all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, and then, but even Charles VIII's story is kind of weird because he dies, on the way back to France or something. So it's just even Ficino, he died in 1498 or something like that. Not
much longer, not much later. He was a bit older.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are some fascinating times. Okay, let's jump tracks here for a second and talk about your Philip K. Dick tarot deck.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for asking. So we are going to be debuting this deck in August at the Philip K. Dick Festival in Fort Morgan, Colorado, which is where the late author was buried. So they have a festival out there. It's less of an academic conference and more of like a meeting of like-minded individuals. It's for fans and fan scholars and people who are just like super into the work of Dick. You don't necessarily have to be like an academic or anything like that. Although I have,
will Jay be there? Jay Kinney?
Oh, Jay Kinney. I've met Jay. I got to meet him through a John Shirley party one day. If you've got his email, send it along to me because I've misplaced it.
Oh yeah, Jay and I've known Jay for a zillion years now. He's an old buddy of mine.
Get me in touch. Yeah,
okay.
I'd love to get it. I've been meaning to message him, but I just searched my email and couldn't find it. So yeah, I had fun hanging out with that guy. I told him, like some fawning fanboy thing. I was just like, your work is so meaningful to me or whatever. He's like, that's what I told the creator of Mad Magazine. And I don't even remember the funny quip that he had. I hope I remember it sometime. Yeah, he was an early commenter on Philip K. Dick's exegesis.
Yeah.
So that's how I first heard of him. I'm sorry, but go ahead and tell your Kinney story.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've known Jane for a long time, but when there was a Philip K. Dick documentary that came out on Netflix maybe like 10 years ago, I don't know. It was a while back. And I was like, oh, Philip K. Dick, this might be interesting. And I start watching it, and there's Jay. And I'm like,
there he is.
Yep. Yeah, well, okay, so I was looking at the tarot deck. I was sort of looking at some of the images. The artwork is really cool. You've got are you doing the art, or you've got somebody helping you out?
So I 5 years ago, I met this fellow, Christopher Wilkie, who's doing the art. I'm sort of the designer, writer. I'm the systems guy, so I did all of the correlation of the elements of Philip K. Dick's writing, his characters, his novels, his titles sometimes, and then also the like mystical ideas that he came up with, like the Black Iron Prison or the Pink Beam from Valis, or all that sort of stuff. So I remember when I first thought of this, it's like way back in college, like almost 20 years ago, I thought, Palmer Eldritch is sort of like the devil, and we got a tarot here, the Black Iron Prison is the tower, and it all just sort of fell into place, and I realized that the symbolism of the tarot was the best way to kind of express the esoteric system that Philip K. Dick was trying to design. And so it's a way of, kind of showing the esoteric side of Philip K. Dick to people who are, just fans of his characters and weird sci-fi objects and, all that sort of stuff. Trying to explain the mystical stuff to the sci-fi people. And, Dick wrote this 9,000 pages of notes called his exegesis. It runs to like 1 million words, often handwritten, scrawled in the middle of the night on some crazy bender of writing. And, he had these weird visionary experiences. He novelized them as Radio Free Albemuth and Valis. There was recently a great movie made of Radio Free Albemuth, so you can actually see the Valis story on film.
Wait, there's a Valis
there was an independent film, Radio Free Albemuth. I had the pleasure of working on promoting it and the Kickstarter and stuff. I pasted flyers all around Berkeley for the opening weekend. Great independent film. It's got some great actors. It's got the late Scott Wilson from The Walking Dead. It's got Shea Wiggum, who was in stuff like Boardwalk Empire. And it's got Catherine Winnick, who I remember from a Hellraiser movie, but everybody probably knows from Vikings. So, yeah, highly recommend that film if you're interested in the Valis story. That and the Robert Crumb comic are the best ways to become familiar with the religious experience of Philip K. Dick, which is really what I'm trying to capture in the tarot. I do my research partly on the esoteric stuff in the Renaissance, but partly also in the reception of that material in people like Philip K. Dick, Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, which you can read about in a great book by Eric Davis, just came out, High Weirdness. I can't stop saying nice things about.
Oh man, Eric Davis, I've been hearing his name a lot lately.
But so, Dick was a reader of Francis Yates, which I found out
Are you
through
Wait, hold on. Seriously?
Yeah, I found out through Pamela Jackson that he borrowed a copy of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment from somebody, probably K.W. Jeter or maybe Tim Powers. I need to ask these guys about it one of these days.
Wait, the Tim Powers? Like Tim Powers, the novelist?
Right, yeah, and K.W. Jeter also most well-known novelist who were friends of Dick's at the time and in the period when he was going through his religious experiences. And so yeah, Dick. I discovered that Dick read Francis Yates through textual analysis, and I had to confirm it with Pamela Jackson, who's the only person who's read all 9,000 pages of exegesis. So somewhere in some unpublished note, Dick mentions reading the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And when he describes in the Appendix of Valis his take on people like Paracelsus, Giordano Bruno, and Jakob Burma, his idea of what the Hermetic alchemists were supposedly looking for with this entity made of information that was buried with the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels. He's basically articulating a theory of Hermeticism that sounds a lot like Francis Yates. Right. So that's what my first conference paper about Dick and alchemy and Hermeticism and whatever it was all about. And I'm working on a book about Dick and Hermeticism, or rather Dick and esotericism, but a lot of it is a view of Hermeticism that's kind of inspired by the Rosicrucian movement, and then refined by these scholarly takes of Francis Yates. And that was also a big influence on Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson writes about a conversation he had with Timothy Leary about it in The Cosmic Trigger. So yeah, one of the kind of hidden histories of psychedelia is that the Yates thesis had its impact on some of the greats in psychedelic writing in the 70s. So long story short, that's what my tarot deck is about. And
I'm still trying to take in this stuff. I totally did not realize that Dick had read Yates. I also didn't realize that any of those other guys knew anything about Yates either. Like, that's just fascinating to me. Well, if you had been at
UC Davis to see my presentation, you might have known back in 2006 or no, that was... I forget what year that was, 2015, whenever it was that I presented on Dick and alchemy. You might have heard, but no, this is kind of underground stuff. I mean, this is what I'm discovering and working on. You can listen to a couple of my podcasts if you go to my Twitter feed. I think it's linked in the bio.
Okay,
where right. I did a couple of interviews with a podcast called The Occult Sentinel, I believe, Joe Moore's podcast, where I talked all about my research on Dick and esotericism, and I've also recorded my conference paper that I did at UC Davis sometime in the early 2010s, like 2012 or thereabouts, where I talk about the Francis Yates connection and the Paracelsus, Jakob Burma, and whatever. Dick was also interested in Neoplatonism, and he had basically an encyclopedia article about Plotinus. So I've also given a talk about Dick and Plotinus and Neoplatonism. That was at the San Francisco Philip K. Dick Fest around the same time. That one was definitely in 2012.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to learn more about that, I did talk about that in those little pieces. You can read the appendix to Valis where he talks about these guys. But yeah, the Francis Yates thing I had to figure out on my own, and I had to. It was actually an email that Eric Davis sent to Pamela Jackson confirming the Francis Yates stuff. But yeah, anybody who's interested who happens to know K.W. Jeter or Tim Powers and could ask them about that. I've talked to Tessa about it, and she doesn't really remember anything that would be useful. She's told me some interesting stuff though. I also used to work for Philip K. Dick's ex-girlfriend Grania Davis, the late and lamented author in her own right. She was an amazing, just sort of tower of the local San Francisco sci-fi community, and had a lot to say that kind of initiated me into that scene.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a ridiculous amount of material there. I mean, you've kind of blown me away with the stuff that you've already told me. So I kind of need to think about that for a second. So let's go a little technical on the tarot deck. So you said that you based it on Philip K. Dick's religious experiences, or you wanted to sort of get that across. Are you using a lot of imagery and characters from his novels?
Yeah, so I'm taking characters from his novels, like I mentioned, Palmer Eldritch as the devil, Joe Chip and Glenn Runseter from Ubik play a role. The crap artist from Confessions of a Crap Artist becomes the fool character because I think he's the the archetypal fool in PKD, and you might also see the tire regroover at some point, which was the job that the guy had, right? And so I feel like I realized as I was writing the oracular sentences, there's one sentence with like a kind of divinatory mystical riddle that goes with each card, that I was slanting it in a very kind of anti-capitalist direction, because I think one of my major critical takes on Dick is that he's just a thoroughgoing religious anti-capitalist writer, and a lot of the characters and scenes and world building really adds up to his critique of how capitalism creates and forces unreal worlds on us, right? Capitalism forces all these dubious realities, all of these spurious realities on us, and he sort of sees mystical salvation as a way out of a false reality. So I'm using the traditional symbology of the tarot. We kept the 4 elements, we kept having 10 pip cards, and we kept having 4 court cards. We're both mostly familiar with the Aleister Crowley Thoth tarot, the Rider-Waite tarot, and other like kind of Golden Dawn era interpretations of the tarot deck. I'm a fan of the Tabby Cicero deck, which uses the authentic Golden Dawn coloring system. And I was also influenced by Lon Malo Duquette's ceremonial magic tarot, the way that he integrates stuff like the demons of the Goetia into the tarot.
Right.
And so Christopher, the artist, had the idea of integrating the I Ching, which I signed up for. And that plays
totally
a role
makes
too.
Sense. Yeah.
So the I Ching is kind of mapped out onto the cards in a way that I let him take the lead on. And Christopher knows a lot about Dick himself, so there's all kinds of stuff that he's put into the art that I haven't even seen necessarily yet, or I've signed off on, but I haven't studied, very closely. So he's putting all kinds of little references. So one of the ex-wife cards, is holding a can of horse meat from the pet food store where Dick used to go buy horse meat when he was really poor, right?
Right.
There's all kinds of subtle biographical references that that Christopher, who knows his Dick very well, has put in there too. So it's it's really just a labor of love on the part of both of us, putting in as much as we could. And there's a funny story about that. Towards the end of the project, I sort of woke up in a cold sweat one night, and I thought, we don't have an eye in the sky card. Like, what are we going to do? And, I emailed Christopher about it, and he was having trouble with finding a design for the orthogonal time card, which I think is covered in the Black Iron Prison anyway, right? So we ended up putting eye in the sky in that spot, and it was perfect because part of the Glenn Runsiter sentence was, "There's no eye in the sky in team," and I was able to just put that into the eye in the sky and keep the sentence about graffiti for Glenn Runsiter. So that's just one example of the fun I was having with the design.
So your court cards aren't named like Prince, Princess, King, Queen. They're
you
else.
might find things more like the dark-haired girl of swords, or the boss of wands.
And then in the major arcana, you have kind of mixed stuff up. So you mentioned there's a Fool card, but like you must have changed a bunch of the major arcana to fit more of the big concepts.
Yeah, they've been changed a lot. So like we have cards that sometimes come close or sometimes might be a little bit off. Like I forget if I used the pink beam was the chariot, right? So there's some of the symbolism of the chariot there, and I did what I could to preserve the original structure of the tarot, but for the most part, I had to take artistic liberties, and the Philip K. Dick stuff is going to win out over the original symbolism. So yeah, it's not what I would call a one-to-one correspondence, and I think that we ended up with 24 instead of 22 trump cards.
Yeah.
So it's an 80 card deck. It's not a 78 card deck. So it's not meant to be it's not that I don't believe that there's an authentic set of tarot attributions out there anyways, right? Like, having done a little bit of research on the history of the tarot, right? You know, you can see that Eliphas Levi, right, I believe was the guy who made up the connection of tarot and Kabbalah out of whole cloth. And, you know, before then, like, nobody was reading it that way. And this whole elaborate Golden Dawn structure, I mean, it's a beautiful structure, right? But it's kind of built on sand in a way. And, you know, I mean...
Well, I mean, even Waite, in a letter, he expressed a lot of doubts about the ties between the Kabbalistic stuff and tarot. He's like, I just don't know. I've been working with this for years, and I still don't see it.
And mapping it out onto the astrological deacons and everything. I mean, it's all, like, great stuff. And it's like, if we're a microcosm, macrocosm, like, it doesn't need to be authentic to be, you know, something that makes sense. You know, like I was saying about Pico being able to extrapolate from a Kabbalistic text that he did have to figure out something that was in a text that he didn't have, right? We can make creative use of this material and still not be going totally wrong, especially when you're trying to think of this as like a mystical tool rather than a intellectual exercise in finding the truth about, you know, the lineage of these esoteric transmissions and,
absolutely.
You know, throughout history.
Somebody made all of it up originally anyhow.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's fun, you know, and so, like, I don't believe that there really is a, you know, sacred structure of tarot that, you know, I mean, I think there's all kinds of interesting resonances in the structure that are important. And so I wanted to keep as much of it as possible. But we felt free to kind of branch out. And in addition to the I Ching integration, we've also got some games that you can play with the deck. Christopher's working on the text of that, so I can't say too much about the games. And, you know, we're going to be putting out a bigger book later with a lot more. We're going to have full-page interpretations of every card explaining how we wove the symbolism together and artist notes and, you know, more mystical suggestions and meditations and all that, which is all exercises that I'm doing, you know, to kill two birds with one stone to prepare me to write this book on Dick and esotericism. You know, I believe that in a way, like, Dick was designing his own esoteric system, and he kind of gave that to us. We've already seen Dick's influence as, you know, giving a certain flavor of Gnosticism to the world, right? He popularized Gnosticism. He, you know, he was rooted in people like Carl Jung, like he was, you know, like Joseph Campbell. He was such a fan of Star Wars and everything. I mean, you know, Dick really, like, transmitted Gnosticism in this special way, like, through science fiction and psychedelia to the counterculture in America. And, you know, we have him to thank for, I believe, a sort of a Gnostic church, right? There's kind of just like a collection of Phil Dickian magi out there who have been inspired by this guy and, you know, by what he gave us. So through the tarot, I'm trying to kind of pay tribute to that and kind of, if not formalize it, because I don't believe that it should be formalized, you know, it's just showing one way that you can do an interpretation, right? And using the tarot as a kind of a language to write that interpretation. I don't believe I'm giving you, you know, the last word on what Dick meant by the pink beam, but I do believe that it can be assembled into a coherent esoteric tool like a tarot deck.
And this deck will be ready in August?
In August, yeah, and you can pre-order it right now through Wide Books, and I believe I've given you the link. So we can link this podcast to the pre-order site. And what you got to do, if you're attending the festival in Colorado, you just donate $40 to the festival, and you'll get your deck. And if you need to have it shipped, you can add $4.50 for domestic and $25 for international shipping.
Okay, all right, I will make sure that there's a link down in the show notes. That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. Please pre-order. We need those pre-orders. I'm not sure if we can guarantee availability beyond, you know, the festival. So, you know, if you really want to get your hands on this, you know, you got to pre-order it. I don't know if we're going to be able to, you know, fly under the radar of the litigious PKD estate, if we're going to, you know, have any difficulty with that. And
you also have an Alchemy coloring book that's either out or coming out?
In production. We've got about 12 of the designs finished. I'd like to get a few more of the designs that I really wanted to get in there going. And, you know, there's kind of limited funding for me to pay the artist I've got working on that. We're going to do, like, it's the emblems from classical woodcuts, like A Talent of Fugianes by Michael Meyer, or Eliminate manuscripts, like those kind of things. Okay. The Splendor Solis, the the Mutus Liber, all these beautiful old books, and just trying to get some of the main creatures and mottos of alchemy illustrated. So my graphic designer takes the old woodcuts and he uses a vector graphics program to retrace them and takes out all of the cross hatching and the gray areas and whatnot so that it looks more like a coloring book image, but it's drawn directly from the the originals. Another one we've got is the Rosicrucian Mountain of Initiation allegory, where somebody's encountering all these alchemical symbols as they rise up the mountain. So it was originally conceived as more of a kind of an academic thing where I'd be writing these dense descriptions full of footnotes and pitch it as like an undergraduate scholarly textbook. But, I'm finding that I don't have the time to research and write all that. And we're probably going to put out a more basic version with some brief descriptions, explaining, but it's not going to be a, really heavy, dense text. It's going to be more just for fun, like an adult coloring book.
That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I've got a coloring book based on the Rider-Waite's Major Arcana. That's pretty fun.
Oh, great, yeah.
Have you considered doing a Kickstarter for the coloring book?
That's not a bad idea.
I think it's an amazing idea.
I haven't had all sorts of success with crowdfunding so far, so I really need a crowdfunding guru or something to help me figure out how to pitch these things. But yeah, that's definitely something. I feel like we're trying to just put together a little finished product that is like a proof of concept, and then maybe from there we'll go and kickstart a 200-page alchemy coloring book with all of those scholarly writings that I want to do and everything. I could definitely see making it more and more ambitious. And eventually I'd love to write like the undergraduate textbook. Another one of my projects that is sort of a year late is to do an online course about 7 or 10 of those most famous alchemical illustration books, which would be building on a course that I designed and taught way back in grad school at Stark King at the Graduate Theological Union. I taught a little course called Illustrations of the Alchemical Art, or Images of the Alchemical Art, something like that. It was a fun little course for grad students. And one of my students who came to that class, Lissa Dirham, needed an alchemy class because she was writing her thesis about Hermeticism in Swedenborg. And so I got this great paper on alchemy in Swedenborg. And, she was just
a whole other school of angelology there, huh?
Right in on the current events in that field. And later on I saw her her professor give a talk that incorporated some of that, those kind of findings. So yeah, Blake commented about how Swedenborg was similar to that tradition that PKD was interested in, right? Like when Blake said that one could, with one's mechanical talents, take the works of Paracelsus and mechanically crank out a Swedenborg.
Ted, I can't believe how much stuff we've managed to cram into our talk.
Yeah, it's been dense. I didn't even get to talk about the Hypnerotomachia.
Oh, I even brought mine up. Look, I've got it right here.
To be continued, then. We'll have to do another show, maybe.
Let's just promise everybody we're going to do another show. It's going to be all about the Hypnerotomachia, Polyphily,
art of memory, alchemy. It's going to be fun.
It's going to be great. Yeah, and in the meantime, you've sort of listed off a ton of stuff that my dilettantish approach to studying Pico and Ficino has. Now I just have more shit to read.
Check it out. Get back to me with questions. I'm always happy to talk about this material.
I will. This is great.
You've given me a few things that I need to be more solid on, that I wasn't quite prepared to expound on in a little chat.
Yeah, well, next time, huh? Okay, so then, all right, so I have, so in the show notes, there'll be a link to the tarot deck thing on Wide Books. I'll put a link to your publishing company for the alchemy coloring book.
Oh yeah, thriceblessedpress.com.
Yeah.
Bit of a mouthful, but I feel like it captures my brand.
Why don't you tell people how to find you on Twitter and
Oh,
Instagram
sure, yeah.
and stuff?
I'm at T3DY on Twitter, and I couldn't get T3DY on Instagram because some rapper has it, so I'm at T3DY Hand on Instagram, and you can get me ted.hand on Gmail if you want to ask me any, more involved questions.
All right, I will do you a favor, and I will not link your email address in the show notes. because that'll just open
the floodgates.
Yeah. Have you listened to T3DY the Rapper?
I haven't gotten around to it.
Maybe we'll see if we can.
It's charming that somebody has picked up on my old AOL handle from the 90s, inspired by Are You Serious?'s cyberpunk fake book, but I haven't looked into the fella. We should have a rap battle sometime. I've got a little bit of freestyle skills myself.
Oh yeah, you wanna wrap the episode up?
I do.
Thank you for listening to the Arnemancy podcast. You can find me online at arnemancy.com, where you can schedule a tarot reading or peruse the Arnemancy blog. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcatcher. If you like this podcast, support it for just $1 a month through Patreon at patreon.com/Arnemancy.